Welcome everyone to another edition of the National Conservative Institute of Australia podcast. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Zachary Gorman of the Robert Menzies Institute based in Melbourne. Zachary is the academic coordinator of that institute, a professional historian. He's worked as a researcher and academic since 2013, including several years at the University of Wollongong, where he received his PhD. He's authored 3 books: Sir Joseph Carruthers, founder of the New South Wales Liberal Party, Summoning Magna Carta, Freedom Symbol Over a Millennium, and another one on early Australian Prime Minister Joseph Cook. He is responsible for pulling together a range of books on Sir Robert Menzies, the Young Menzies, Success, Failure and Resilience, the Menzies Watershed, Liberalism, Anti-Communism, Continuities. He's been published in a wide range of peer-reviewed academic journals. Welcome, Zachary. What did I miss out, or what should I have added to your bio?
No, that's plenty. Like, that's more than enough, I'm sure.
I should also add that the Robert Menzies Institute is a valuable resource. I have been particularly interested in listening to the Afternoon Light podcast, which Georgina Downer hosts. For anyone interested in early Australian history and the issues and individuals involved, it's incredibly interesting listen. Which is not to say I agree with all of the takes that the Robert Menzies Institute has at the moment. And so, to kick things off, I thought it'd be useful to ask Zachary, how was the Liberal Party of Australia, which formed in 1944, in your view, different in terms of philosophy to the British Liberal Party, which had essentially died out in the UK by that stage?
I've always argued, and I always take the longer view of Australian liberalism. I'm very, in my work, even though I now work for an institute dedicated to Robert Menzies, I'm very keen on the fact that Australian liberalism is our oldest political tradition. It certainly didn't start with the Liberal Party in 1944, and the Liberal Party can't claim a sort of ownership of it. It's a set of ideas and beliefs and a cult embedded in the culture, all these sorts of things. But what I would say, generally speaking, is that Australia is a time capsule of Gladstonian liberalism. So our liberalism is inherently sort of borrowed or evolved from British liberalism, as you might expect. Our whole political culture is set up on British institutions. And in the 19th century, when we first get responsible government and democracy, people in Australia are constantly reading British news. They're constantly paying attention to what's happening in Westminster. And the great hero of 19th century Australians was William Gladstone. I've even written a whole journal article on the image of William Gladstone in the Australian colonies and how he was sort of idolized. But the main thing to remember about Gladstone, compared to what British liberalism became in the early 20th century, shortly before it sort of flatlined as far as a political movement, is that Gladstonian liberalism was still skeptical of the state. It saw the state as a vehicle for entrenched and vested interests. So Gladstonian liberalism focused on sort of cutting spending to ensure that you wouldn't have as much taxes, holding people back, encouraging education and equality of opportunity, these sorts of things. As a particularly, say, also there's the abolition of the Corn Laws, so getting rid of tariffs, so basic foodstuffs would be cheaper for poor working people, these sorts of things. So it is British liberalism, but it's not 20th century British liberalism, which starts going down that social liberal path, which ultimately leads to American liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long period of time between the time of Gladstone and then the time of Federation, and liberalism in the UK went through some various iterations and was placed under particular challenges, right? But by 1935, when George Dangerfield famously wrote The Strange Death of Liberal England, the Liberal Party there had ceased to be certainly wasn't the major player anymore like it was in Gladstone's time. And some of the issues that you mentioned, like trade and foreign policy to a certain extent as well, had the attitudes to that had changed. Surely, is it really credible to think that Menzies in 1944, looking at what had happened to the British Liberal Party, would have taken that as his model?
Well, I wouldn't say that Menzies took the British Liberal Party as a direct model. In fact, there was sort of debate around the name Liberal Party, and part of the issues with that was he didn't necessarily want to be associated with the British model. What I'm saying is that Gladstone informed what Australian liberalism became, and then Menzies is picking up the traditions of Australian liberalism. So he's very careful to use the phrase a liberal revival when he's referring to what he's trying to do in the 1940s. He's aware that he's not inventing a new political faith. He's actually resurrecting something that used to be highly successful in Australia. And it's because it has those cultural roots that it resonates. If you're just starting something from scratch, and this is where like that there's an element of Burke or element of conservatism to it, is that political ideologies that sort of succeed and become mainstream, like can set up a whole party that can be a part of a two-party system, they have to be embedded in the culture. They can't sort of be invented from scratch, in my opinion.
Why do you think, because this is relevant to Australia, why do you think the British Liberal Party did die out in the way in such dramatic fashion? I mean, it was so ascendant in the time of Gladstone and Lloyd George, and then from 1906 when it had its big victory, it really petered out by the 30s.
I think British liberalism never succeeded in achieving its goals in the way that Australian liberalism did. That Australian liberalism had this blank slate with no established church, no landed aristocracy. So you could really set up this place to be a land of opportunity, that, or as Joseph Cook used to call it, the land of the better chance. And all the sort of economic statistics about social mobility and about owning your own home and all these things, you can see those already coming out in the 19th century, how much better Australia was than Britain, even to the extent that one of the reasons they stopped transporting convicts to Australia was because it was starting to be seen as less as a punishment, because once your sentence was up, you were liable to earn a lot more in Australia than you could have in Britain. In Britain, you had those entrenched interests, and the Liberal Party never really succeeded in shifting them, and therefore it created this search for greater sort of state-driven solutions that ultimately led to social liberalism and then the Labor Party. Whereas in Australia, the birth of the Labor Party was not directed against a conservative party, because there was no conservative party. It was directed against what was the establishment, and the establishment was liberalism, which is also how liberalism ends up being on the centre right and sort of associated with conservatism, because you were conserving a liberal order that had already established itself.
Right. And I don't want to overly labour this point, but I think it is very interesting, because the relationship between Australia and the UK was fundamental, right, in terms of political ideas and economics and everything, and flow of people. And so by 1900, you had people like Sir Joseph Chamberlain, Minister of the Colonies, who was a Liberal, started off as a member of the Liberal Party, but was reassessing the trading arrangements that the UK had with its peers at that stage. Very quickly industrializing Germany, the United States, and indeed the relationships with the colonies, who had also imposed tariffs on goods coming not only from other parts of the world, but also from the UK. Is it a question of, I'm just trying to get to why that Liberal Party died out in the UK, and what lessons Menzies might have taken from that when when forming his new party in 1944? What lessons, both in terms of organization, but also in terms of where the ideology might have had its limits, or what its shortcomings might have been that caused that result?
I think, like, Menzies, as much as he wanted to be a progressive party, and that's a key element to the formation of the Liberal Party, is that it's not enough to just be conservative or reactionary. You actually have to put up your own vision of progress. You have to have an alternative to a sort of left or social progressive idea of what progress means. So even though he was setting up a progressive party, he also knew that there wasn't necessarily a future in a party purely of the center. That you need to have a successful two-party system. You need to be offering a viable alternative to your opponent. That there needs to be a sort of philosophical battle, a battle of ideas that's really encapsulated in the two sides of the lines of cleavage of politics. And that's what you get quite starkly in the 40s, less so in the 50s and 60s, because, the Liberal Party's embracing Keynes and certain forms of economic interventionism. But certainly in the 1940s, where you have Labor's grand plans for post-war reconstruction, it's really extensive referendums seeking to change the constitution to centralize power in the Commonwealth, and then the nationalization plans, not just of the banks, but other things like airline travel, healthcare. Basically, the banks was the tip of the iceberg.
That was obviously later in the 20th century, but it just occurs to me that there was this golden age of British liberalism in the late 19th century, the age of Cobden and Bright and unilateral free trade from Britain, and so many, in many ways, that kind of, I think it mirrors our own time, or at least there are parallels with our own time. But that had changed by 1900 in the UK. The mood had changed, and it wasn't simply a kind of that they'd taken that there were shortcomings that had started to appear, and there were political solutions that were being proposed to try to address those shortcomings, which were also mirrored a bit here in Australia. Maybe I'll take it on at least in my maybe I'll take on a slightly different track. Australia obviously isn't the only New World country that has a centre-right party, but in other parts of the world, they're not called the Liberal Party. I mean, New Zealand has the National Party. The Canadians have the Conservative Party. Americans have the Republican Party. So I guess my question is, to mangle Shakespeare, what's in a name? Goes his line from Romeo and Juliet. Isn't it true that if the name of a party in Australia was called the National Party of Australia or the Conservative Party of Australia, it actually wouldn't make that much of a difference?
I think that there are historic reasons for not wanting to be called conservative. That conservative was thought of as old-style British Toryism, which had no roots here whatsoever. That the Bunyip aristocracy was sort of laughed out of town. Liberalism has a set of ideas sort of baked into it. I know those ideas are extremely contested, hence you have classical liberalism versus social liberalism. But conservatism and nationalism are very contingent concepts, that you're conserving that which already exists. So that which already exists could vary immensely from nation to nation, but also from era to era. I mean, that one of the issues that modern conservatism faces is, how do you conserve? How do you conceptualize yourself as a conservative party if you don't control any of the institutions and you don't really like much of how society is looking at the moment? So liberalism purports to have ideals that aren't as conditional as that are more universal, and certainly have very deep historic roots stretching back to Magna Carta and John Locke and all these people that are normally cited, but I also, in summoning Magna Carta, have looked at the sort of theological roots of people like John of Salisbury and the debates that led to people accepting that it's just to kill a tyrant and all these sorts of things.
But just as a sort of practical matter, if you're hanging out with members of the Conservative Party in Canada or the New Zealand National Party, politicians, is there any huge difference in character to political culture because they call themselves the National Party and the Conservative Party in Canada, and we call ourselves the Liberal Party? In practice, does that make a huge amount of difference?
It's the chicken or the egg. I think that the different labels reflect the different cultures rather than the other way around. So it's a reflect. The fact that we're called liberal is a product of our unique history and culture, and as conservatives, that's sort of what you're meant to embrace. You're meant to have this Burkean sense of a sort of organic evolution of culture. You don't want some global homogenized conservative movement, because homogenization and globalism, that is the antithesis of not only what conservatism is, but also what liberalism is. Because one of the key components of liberalism is subsidiarity, the idea that political decisions should be made at the most local level that is practicable, and ideally, where possible, by the individual themselves.
Right, but I guess if you're using the term liberal in the name of a party, and you're at least making some claim that it embodies the philosophical liberalism, that exists also in views held by the National Party of New Zealand and the Conservative Party of Canada, and the Republican Party in the United States, right? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I feel like sometimes there's too much investment in the name of the party. And sometimes, again, to be frank, I've seen it used sort of in internecine party disputes where people like to claim, in relation to a particular policy, typically a progressive policy being advanced, we've got to embrace this because even though Menzies wouldn't have, in a million years signed up for it, this is what liberalism means, that we are the Liberal Party of Australia. And liberalism means, there's obviously a lot of debate about precisely the exact meaning of it, but at some level it's about ensuring that individual autonomy is maximized to a certain extent without constraint from tradition and at least unreasonable or irrational tradition or constraint. And I think you can have those discussions with the National Party of New Zealand and the Conservative Party of Canada, and indeed the Conservative Party of the UK, without resorting to this mantle claiming that, oh no, our party is called this, therefore we have to agree with these particular solutions. And I'm sure you've experienced these type of arguments in the past in Australia, where people do try and claim, John Howard used the term conservative, but no, we're a Liberal Party, and that's, while Conservatives might be able to exist as a sort of subsection of the Liberal Party, that's not really what we are meant, the party that Menzies formed and what we are about.
I agree that the term small L liberal is problematic, because small L liberal, the term is used to describe not liberalism at all. It's not people who are more classically liberal than the Conservatives in the Liberal Party. It's often purely used to describe centrism or moderation, or whatever you want to describe that as, just bowing to the political consensus or bowing to the more progressive views, rather than something that's sort of truly thought out. And Menzies, even in his later years, there is a quote from Menzies complaining about how small L liberals believe in nothing. But because people misuse the term to then seed a term that has such historical importance for Australians. To me, is preposterous. And the idea that you would have a debate over what liberalism means is actually a positive if it happens with clarity and with people really engaging in it, because you want politics to be a battle of ideas. One of the problems we face in modern politics is so much of it is just managerialism and absence of ideas. So I encourage the debate over what liberalism means, and I accept that small L liberal is a problematic label, but it's not problematic enough for us to abandon such a core element of Australian political history.
Yeah, I guess these debates about, which tend to be all-consuming and never-ending in Australia, about liberalism, they, the Conservative Party of Canada and the National Party of New Zealand, they don't feel quite as obliged to go through that, in my view. The Republican Party in the United States, about, are we being true liberals, small L, or a large L to the party that Menzies founded, because their party name does not include that term. It is either a party, as I think you and others and Kemp argued, that is trying to embody liberalism as different people can understand it, or it's a party that has taken that name, but is like the Conservative Party of Canada or the National Party in New Zealand or the Republicans in the United States, is simply a vehicle for the centre-right more broadly defined.
Yeah, but I find the centre-right is a way worse term, because that means nothing. The centre-right means nothing, because the centre couldn't be more amorphous. These labels of centre-right, far-right, they achieve no clarity. They're just shorthand for lazy journalists. Like, I have a real problem with that sort of this homogenization, seeking to make things as simple as possible when they should actually be complex, because they're ultimately about principles.
Right. It's just that, okay, maybe I'll take another different tack. Do you think that people on the right tend to bemoan the fact that those on the left, broadly defined, tend to have a negative view of Australian history in some ways? But do you feel that there's also a strain on the right which takes a spiteful, or at least a disappointed, view of Australian history from federation? There was much excitement prior to federation about different liberal ideas, but then with federation itself, you get restrictive immigration policy, you get a protectionist tariff regime, and I just feel like, reading through people like David Kemp, that new book from William Coleman about federation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, The Fiery Cross of Union, and others, there's always this sense that, oh goodness, if we only hadn't taken the wrong path and we'd listened to good old George Reed or Bruce Smith or Keith Hancock or your subject, Joseph Carruthers, it would have all been better. But and eventually, after 70 plus years, we started to re-emerge and become, more economically liberal and open again, like we should have done prior to at federation. Do you appreciate? Do you understand that critique, or what do you?
Yeah, that liberals don't like the Australian settlement. Yeah, of course. I would have voted no to federation. I've written a whole article on why Sydney, on both occasions, voted no to federation. It was only rural New South Wales, which used to be a far bigger proportion of the votes, that got New South Wales across the line to actually support federation. And a lot of those people were voting yes to federation because what they actually wanted was new states. They were voting for federation to secede from Sydney. So I agree that, like, federation was a mistake, but not necessarily what to me it means to be Australian. Is not just this one political story about Tosspot Toby trying to self-aggrandize.
But isn't it, don't you think that's sort of, we're talking about 70 plus years of Australian history from Federation until, well, Whitlam or Hawke Keating, I suppose. And don't you think that undercuts the achievement of Australia during that time? Because the Australian settlement, and I know it's much criticised by classical liberals and all the rest of it, but it achieved it developed an incredible nation. It achieved an incredible success in the establishment of the world's deepest middle class. Australia prospered under that supposedly misguided regime. We didn't have we were quite a cohesive community. We didn't have, I like to say Australia was the safest place to be a Jew in the 20th century. We didn't have, didn't have the same type of problems that other people in the world encountered. And so isn't it a bit unfair to those, including Menzies, who I think you would say supported the Australian settlement during his time in office, to sort of say they should have all done it differently if only they'd listened to George Reeve?
There's two problems there. One is you're giving the Australian settlement credit for things that had been achieved in the 19th century, the depth of our middle class and our prosperity. That had all been established in the 19th century, and then it actually sort of petered out in the 20s and particularly, obviously, the 30s. Secondly, the Australian settlement is a problematic, historical projection. There's a reason it was invented by a journalist, not a historian. You can't shoehorn all of Australian history into this idea that things were settled for 80 years. I mean, we've already mentioned the incredibly deep philosophical battles that went on in the 1940s. So I think that there are positive things in Australia, say Menzies revivifying the Australian middle class that had actually sort of tanked during the height of the Australian settlement. And I would argue that Menzies' period, while it fits into the Australian settlement, it's not by any means the height of the Australian settlement. I mean, you have the Australia-Japan Commerce Agreement, you have the selling of vast quantities of wheat to China, you have the opening up of the iron ore mining in Western Australia. A lot of the open economy of the later 20th century has its roots in the Menzies era, and David Lee has 3 different chapters in our MUP series documenting that.
Yeah, but okay, it's a Paul Kelly term which he I've got the book probably in front of me somewhere, which he invented to describe that period. And you can argue, quibble at the edges, but in terms of Australia maintaining a high tariff wall, a very restrictionist immigration policy, focused on European immigration, and centralized wage fixing as well, they were maintained during that time. They were defended by Menzies. This idea that because he signed, I think there is this argument, which I've heard many times, that, oh no, Menzies was just a product of his time and he didn't really understand economics and he was a avuncular kind of civic-minded fellow. But now we know better in the 80s, Hawke Keating, how to run an economy, how to run an open economy. And the reality is, he defended explicitly that high tariff wall. And I think what's misunderstood is the reason why he did so is he'd seen, and he wasn't alone globally, right? New Zealand, United States, Canada, they had also all came to the same conclusion regarding why unilateral free trade that Britain had practiced in the 19th century did not make sense in that period of history from the 20th century until the 80s because of geopolitical realities. And I think we undersell the prudence and the wisdom of that approach, and downplay. You say that the middle class was a lot bigger in the late 19th century. I mean, let's take that as a given, but it was maintained and grew further from 1900 until 1970 plus. Many other countries weren't able to achieve that. Surely some credit has to be given to the policy framework, which was established on a bipartisan basis, and not kind of engage. And again, I'll be a bit critical, but I'm not engaged in sort of this whimsical stuff that, oh, we would have done so much better if we just listened to George Read, or we just listened to these people in the late 19th century, which were, let's be honest again, emphatically rejected by the Australian people. They simply did not want to become an open borders, free trade, come from anywhere immigration policy regime. Isn't that the problem with this type of approach, which harks back to the sort of glory years of the late 19th century, and assuming that should have been maintained for the entirety of the 20th?
Well, you've just gone straight back to homogenizing those 70 years, because that's the only way you can find growth. If you actually divide it up into the decades, it is in the sort of Menzian era where you have the more moves towards the liberal economy. And this another one is, don't say that had bipartisan support. Basically, the imposition of the Australian settlement was a conspiracy of the 311s, where there was no clear victories for anyone in a given election, and it was all Deacon's shady horse trading with crossbenchers.
But you say that,
that imposed it.
Yeah, this is what I'm getting at. You say that, and it was all a bit. It's always painted as sort of squalid, but the same conclusions were reached in New Zealand, the same conclusions were reached in Canada, the same conclusions were reached in the United States with respect to trade barriers, immigration restriction, those type of. We can't slander the whole of. Not, I mean, they can't have all been squalid little deals across the Anglo sphere. Surely there must have been wisdom in the approach that they adopted.
Well, the one thing I will concede is that there are global trends in economics, and it is very hard to completely ignore global trends. It would have been more difficult for Australia to maintain its free trade stance in a world where there were less and less free trade nations, of course. But one of the main reasons why Australia ended up not being a free trade country was entirely structural, in the fact that 5 out of the 6 states, so every state other than New South Wales, relied entirely on tariff revenue to fund their state governments. So you couldn't have free trade imposed and have the economic system work as it was set up, hence the inclusion of the Braddon Clause. Like, there's all these sorts of contingencies.
But do you believe Menzies didn't genuinely believe in that it was appropriate for Australia to have a high tariff regime? Do you think he was? Because I sometimes get the impression reading people on the liberal right in Australia that, oh no, he didn't really believe it, despite the fact he explicitly says he is a protectionist and his dad's a protectionist, and he doesn't think that the great industrial enterprises of Australia would have been able to succeed without the high tariff regime. But there's this tendency to say, oh, he's saying that because he was a product of his time and he had to say that, but really he was a sort of this proto-liberal at heart. Do you think he was that, or do you just think he wasn't? He was a true believer in the tariff regime, or he was insincere in what he was saying?
It's a chicken or the egg thing, because he's a popular political figure, so he's going to reflect mainstream opinions as much as he's shaping mainstream opinions. I know that Kemp has gone pretty far in his thesis on how Menzies was trying to erode the Australian settlement. Menzies was a gradualist. He never envisaged himself as a revolutionary. So I really don't think that he ever had any sort of concept of completely unwinding something. But he did want to make these gradual changes, and it's clear the trajectory throughout the Menzies era was the gradual changes were towards liberalizing the economy. So a lot of it is that this judging things in their context. So if you put Menzies in, say, 2024, but particularly if you put him in 2000, where it's still more of this like sort of reformist era, then he's going to look incredibly sort of Luddite on his economic policies, and he's going to look very state driven. But if you look at him in the 1940s, in the context of the debates that were going on at the time, he was arguing for less government intervention, less government regulation. It was just, again, that center was in a different space. So it really is hard to transplant him out of the arguments of his day, because he had to work within that context.
But is there sort of a conceit with that type of argument? And it goes along these lines. Menzies was he would have come to the conclusions that we, enlightened ones had come to today, but it was he simply he wasn't able to because of the circumstances under which he worked. But at heart, he believed the same things that we did. Is that really a credible position to hold, or wouldn't it be, more straightforward in actually in accordance with his spoken word to say, no, this guy, he actually did believe in a high tariff regime because he had seen what had happened in the late 19th century in the UK. His, Sidney Sampson, his uncle, he was a believer in protectionist. His dad was a believer in protectionism, and yet we're trying to retrofit him and try and pretend, oh no, he actually wasn't. He actually was a classical liberal at heart, but he had to say that in order to get by politically or reflect the popular opinions of his day. Do you see the logical problem with it?
I don't think his words were hollow. I wouldn't go that far. I think that he did believe in protectionism almost reflexively. He was a Victorian. He wasn't just an Australian. He was a Victorian. This protectionism was a Victorian idea. I mean, Coleman basically argues that federation is the annexation of Australia by Victoria because protection was failing so badly. And certainly if you look at all the population statistics, economic statistics from the late 19th century, New South Wales was doing so much better than Victoria. So I think, of course, growing up in that culture, in that political climate, Menzies did buy into protectionism. But the caveat with that is that then in office, every change he made was not to strengthen protectionism, it was to liberalize the economy. He can only move from the context in which he was in power, and the movements he made were towards liberalization.
Right, but I just think it ignores the broader context, global context, because Canada, the United States, New Zealand were all doing the same. It wasn't just little old Victoria, God love them. People like, I think growing up as a Victorian era, and he was born in the Victorian late 19th century, but they could see the United States behind its tariff wall dramatically industrializing. This is the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln post-Civil War had a high tariff regime as one of its key planks. It was founded on that basis. The national policy of John A. Macdonald in Canada also believed the same thing, and it was successful. I mean, we grew up as a nation. We had a highly industrial, much more industrial economy than we did now. We had a much deeper, wider industrial base, as did Canada, as did the United States. And so, again, why I was harping on so much about the late 19th century, I think it's a very formative period, or relevant period to today, because we've gone through in the Hawke, Keating, Howard era, and in the kind of liberalization that has happened in the, however you want to describe it, the globalism era. In many ways, it does mirror that late 19th century, and in many ways, there is the same type of reaction against it, against this, open borders, one worldism that also existed at that period of time. I mean, Australia established its country because it didn't simply want to be primary producers for industrialized England. We're a nation with a particular people, with a particular economy. We weren't just content to be a free trade zone. And so I just think reading Menzies and putting him in context, it makes perfect sense that he did believe what he did. And it's not, there's liberalism within one country. You can be in favor of not nationalizing the banks and having much freer commerce within a country, but at the same time having a different attitude towards the type of engagement that a nation has with other states. And you can't, and it is possible, as to both be, a believer in liberty under law and the rest of it in your country, but realize that it is there are you need to have borders both in trade and immigration if you are to survive as a nation. And I feel like they're the lessons that are very pertinent to our current age. I mean, do you accept? Do you think also that like the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln, or that it was just an intellectual error, or that it embraced a high tariff regime in the late 19th century? Is that were they not as smart as Hawke Keating Howard?
Well, my favorite president is Grover Cleveland, who's the free trade president and still the only president to have actively reduced the overall size of the federal government. Even Reagan never actually achieved that. And it's actually an important part of the story of federation is in 1892, Grover Cleveland wins the presidential election.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the New South Wales Free Traders agree to support federation, because they, at that time, think that the world is doing the exact opposite of what you're describing, is actually going towards free trade, because that bastion of protectionism that was the United States had just elected a free trade president. What I would say at the very least is that what America can do with the size of its economy is very different to what Australia can do with the size of our economy, as far as having an internal economy that has the economies of scale to actually work at that level. And then there's also the irony that federation is set up to promote free trade. That's the one thing that's baked into the Constitution, is that trade between the states shall be absolutely free.
Internally, it's free, but not externally.
But internally is a concept that the federation creates. That was externally.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, but I don't think even the Abraham Lincolns and the John A. Macdonalds, they're in favor of a free, being able to ship goods from Portland to Portland without internal tariffs, or from Townsville to Tarcoola, right? No one, I don't think any protectionist-minded person thinks there should be internal tariffs. It's tariffs at the border of your nation. It's where they what they espouse. I was just thinking about it. You and I are probably the only two people who discuss Grover Cleveland in relation to his impact on the Australian Federation. But he was the first Democratic president post-Civil War, and he was in many ways an admirable guy. But he was an aberration, right? He got in twice, and he reduced tariffs a bit, but then he was soon replaced by William McKinley, who ramped him up again, right? And so it would be unfair to say that the United States post-Civil War, or the dominant trade policy of the United States post-Civil War was a high tariff regime. It's just the reality of it, as it was in Canada, as it was in New Zealand, as it was after Federation in Australia.
Yeah, well, America didn't really have room for policy debates after the Civil War, because the parties became associated with their respective positions on the war itself. And therefore, a lot of what the Democrats had been arguing for outside of slavery, be it states' rights, be it more free trade, all these sorts of things, got guilt by association. And that's why Grover Cleveland is so exceptional, is that he is a Northern Democrat, the first sort of Northern Democrat to break through after the Democratic Party had been so associated with the Deep South. So it is also the nature of politics that political issues aren't always debated on their merits. There are all sorts of things happening simultaneously, particularly when you're talking about major parties. I mean, it's pretty obvious that if every issue was put to a referendum, as opposed to having to choose one of two options where you're essentially ticking 1,000 boxes at one time when you're picking those boxes, like, you would have very different political outcomes.
100% agree. Everyone is dissatisfied in some particular way. Okay, another question. What do you think or understand by the term national conservatism? You'd be aware it's, there've been conferences held in the United States. What's your general take on it?
Well, I must admit that I am more of a historian than an avid consumer of modern politics. I would say that there is an effort to it's not just a response to sort of economic pressures. It is a response to not just the culture wars, but a cultural crisis in various individual nation states. So it is trying to solve problems that didn't necessarily exist in Menzies' day in some respects, because there was a lot more that both sides of politics agreed on. I mean, Evatt was a very loyal British person. He lauded the history of Magna Carta and how that it was Australia's great inheritance. He was very loyal to the Queen. Like, that, we don't have any of those sort of unifying ideas anymore. So it's quite almost alien to what politics used to be in some respects.
Okay. What about, I know we discussed at the beginning, but liberalism is often spoken about as though it's the epitome of all that is good and true and the last word, or at least the ideal on how modern countries should be governed, right? But isn't it also true that liberalism can be a very dangerous and destructive idea? It can be destructive to traditional institutions. It can be just, I would argue, it can be destructive in terms of trade and destructive in terms of because it has no allegiance to real traditions and to culture and to shared history. It claims to be a doctrine which can be applied, across countries and different worlds. It can easily go off the rails. I mean, I think that's at its heart when the Vice President nominee J.D. Vance was saying America is more than it's not just an idea. It's not just the arguably liberal Enlightenment ideas that were embodied in the parchment of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, but it's a people and a culture and liberalism in some ways is corrosive to those.
I would say that that's a form of liberalism, that Menzies was acutely aware, and it's all through his Forgotten People broadcasts, that there's a lot that goes into creating a successful liberal democratic society. Much of it is cultural. Much of it is this need to uphold values like personal responsibility, thrift, all these sorts of things that have arguably been lost. So the ballast that makes liberalism work, I think, has been eroded. Whether that's a product of liberalism or a particular strand of liberalism is where I think you and I would disagree.
But what checks are there on a liberalism that wants to break through existing definitions, break through national boundaries, break through any sort of idea of a people having particular attributes and being defined by those attributes rather than purely ideological principles? It's how to put it. I mean, there's liberty is important, but so is loyalty, honor, constraint, tradition, passing on the culture. And what stops a liberal regime preventing people from losing thrift and losing some of the traditional characteristics which gave rise to the freedoms that they now enjoy.
Well, it is leaning on the state in part that a lot of this absolute freedom that people of the sort of progressive liberals think that you can have can only be underpinned with that lack of personal responsibility, that you don't have to be financially accountable for the decisions that you're making. But another thing to bring up is that Menzies and all the Australian liberals before him were working within a Judeo-Christian context where there was truth. Like there was absolute truth, and then you would have your freedom around that truth. In a completely secular post-religious age, one of the main problems we're finding is that there is no truth, and then the truth places restrictions on liberty, because you have that, again, these common agreements of what is black and what is white, and as cultures across the West increasingly don't have those anymore.
Well, why do you think that is? See, my argument would be, and of others would be, that liberalism actually dissolves some of those common understandings over time, so that it would be, Menzies would have thought it absolutely ridiculous to debate of what a man or woman is, but that seems to be in play in modern Australia, and it's because of liberalism's tendency to want to break down any constraints on what an individual does or believes or defines themselves as, that we have ended up in this particular result, rather than a situation which says our laws should be about more focused not on the sole criteria of whether this law maximizes individual happiness, but whether it promotes the transmission of our culture and our people to the next generation. It's coming at it from, that's not a, you might be able to accommodate with that liberal notion, but essentially that's coming at it from a very, dare I say, conservative or traditionalist approach.
What you describe as liberalism, I would describe as the cult of progress. That there is this idea baked into Western democracies that society always has to be moving forward, even if things are perfectly fine in certain respects. There's always, you have to find oppressors that you need to be liberated from, and even more so when you don't have religion. There's this real crisis of meaning for Western democracies, where people don't have much to believe in anymore, and they find their meaning in politics and these searches for utopia. And I think that is the real toxic trait. One thing that Menzies would certainly believe in is that there's no such thing as utopia. But he religiously read Burke. He called him the greatest of all practical political philosophers. He wouldn't have been a fan of the French Revolution and that sort of year zero stuff. But again, I don't think that those ideas have ever been a part of Australian liberalism. So that again,
they exist, and there've been fringe people who believe different things, and no doubt been inspired by French Revolutionary type of ideology, but at least in the past. Today, I'm not quite as sure whether there isn't a much bigger constituency that would be up for a year zero type of solution to their problems. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm sure we actually have a fair amount of agreement on that. I guess my question is more interested in, why did we go from the Menzies time with social cohesion, agreement about truths, fair amount of public morality, agreed, shared public morality, to now where there isn't that same level of cohesion and agreement about the way to run a society, and you might, what technological solutions is one possible explanation. But I also think since the 1980s and this idea, like in the late 19th century, this idea that it's liberalism before all, a particular strand of liberalism, granted, that that has been, at least in part, responsible for some of the social ills that we see today.
I
Disagree?
I think you're conflating things. You're conflating and they obviously have certain overlaps, but you're conflating like the economic liberalization of the 1980s with social changes from the 60s and even before that. Like there were complaints about the divorce rate rocketing in the 1940s. So a lot of these things have a lot deeper roots than we otherwise realize. I'm not going to sit here as a historian and purport to know what is behind the disintegration of certain aspects of our culture in quite clearly modern history terms in the last couple of decades. It's not necessarily my expertise, but
Sure.
what I can say is that is to me the contrast. Liberalism worked with balance. Menzies had a phrase he used a lot, which was the importance of a sense of continuity, which is very much he actually associated it with his Scottish heritage, but it really echoes Burke's idea of a compact between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. Menzies described that concept as the idea that we're all part of a grand procession. Howard described it as a conservative being someone who doesn't think that they're morally superior to their own grandfather, all those sorts of things. And obviously, as a historian, I would take that angle, that one of the things we have lost is our understanding of history and our appreciation of history, that, that we're constantly denouncing our own grandfathers. We have no respect for the past and the obstacles that had to be overcome to lead us here, and that's why we keep making the same mistakes again and again.
Okay, I'll wrap it up. I thought it'd be interesting. What do you, as a sort of final question, what do you hope to achieve in the years ahead through your work at the Robert Menzies Institute? What are new projects and the like which you think are worth getting behind?
Well, we constantly have things going on. We've got a new book on the founding of the Liberal Party we're just releasing. But I would say that what the Menzies Institute does in a nutshell is that it's trying to keep alive the study of Australian history. And because Menzies, it takes the Menzian lens, but Menzies was born in 1894. He enters politics in 1928. He retires in 66, but then the impact of the institutions he set up. I mean, he founded the Reserve Bank. Look at all the debates we're having around that at the moment. It's so much of 20th century Australian history that you can explore through the Menzian lens. So yeah, we're trying to keep alive those national stories and those national debates and understand Australian culture a bit more. And say at the University of Melbourne, where we're housed, there really aren't any Australian political historians. So that's not happening within the academy itself. But at the same time, we're finding through our conferences and through the Afternoon Light podcast and all these ways in which we're trying to reach out to people who are doing Australian history, that when you do offer these olive branches and you do try to create these networks, there are all sorts of people who really like that idea, and not just people on the liberal or conservative side of politics. I mean, we've had great interactions with people like Frank Bongiorno and Paul Strangio, and there's a national story that we need to keep alive, and I think Australian politics in general will be healthier if we do keep it alive.
Yeah, well, 100% agree. And like I said at the outset, I have personally really found those podcasts interesting, and the personality and issues that have been covered. I think unless you're actively researching the period of time, that history can be lost, and the nuances involved can be lost. And while we might have different kind of takes as people do on interpreting those events, it's a very, very worthwhile project that yourself and Georgina and the rest of the guys at the Robert Menzies Institute are involved with. So I appreciate it. And thanks again for your time today. Zach, where can people find more information? What were the details on either yourself or the Robert Menzies Institute where people should go to get the details?
Yeah, well, we have a website, robertmenziesinstitute.org.au, but just Google Robert Menzies Institute will come up. And yeah, we have all sorts of resources on there, not just our podcast, but things like our On This Day segments. We have quotes of the week. We have books of the week where we explore. So one of the exciting things we have at the University of Melbourne is Menzies' personal collection of over 4,000 books. And we have a thing where we take a book each week and explore what it reveals about Menzies in Australia in that particular moment in time. So yeah, we've got lots going on.
I'm looking forward to plonking myself there when I go down and having a cup of coffee and having looked through it all and meeting you in person. Thanks again, Zachary, and go well.
Thank you.